The Owl by John Hawkes. Him? Think not of him for your daughter, signore, nor for her sister either. There will be none for him, not him. He has taken his gallows, the noose and knot, to marry. The fathers of Sassofeltore, their chins in hand, let me by and stuffed away the dowries, squinting at the shadow of the tall lady at my side. Though I was named Il Gufo, the owl, I was as tall as she. One by one they deliberated, and well they might, for Sassofeltore had few left who could walk on the cold stone in the morning without clutching their knees, curling their toes, bending their bare narrow backs, who could wake and anticipate the cry of Guai on the cold air. Few, enviable as I. If a father had once seen Il Gufo sucked in his breath when I was pointed out to him, he might climb again to the fortress for another look, alone. Theirs were the wobbling legs, and, at the last minute rubbing tobacco under their lips and turning to flee, they had no word for the hangman. Not one had thought to put his daughter's hand into mine, or expected mine to fall on hers. Now they were tempted. But with each new day, the old fathers of Sassofeltore returned to the field, pressing here and there the suit of a Teresa, Lucia, Antonina, Ginevra. The woman Antonina accompanied her father, and if his task, hasty, Catholic, were not impossible, she made it easier. Even when passing the bodies of the foot soldiers, blackened chimney boys, collected in the ravines like thin logs with blackened shields or visors turned up to the weather, they devised second-best plans for making husband of the prisoner held captive in the hangman's fortress. And at the time when light rain or storm quickly darkened the fortress any hour, my ward Pacento was begging for a wife. The prisoner, delivered into altitude where there was time and silence to devour him, was the hangman's. The fortress which kept him safe was cleft in two parts on the pinnacle of the city, high tower and low tower, and from either battlement there was an iron-edged view of the world, its cliff, the tilted slopes at the bottom, the sunrise and sunset, and, not so far off, the border itself, of a definite black and white. To the east it was possible to find a thin white horizon, the sea. If any in Sassofeltore saw out there a Venetian sail, they pretended it was a dream. The fortress was property willed to Sassofeltore's hangman, also the road winding from the valley, the produce of the fair set up summers at the foot of the mountain, the remains of the monastery and Camposanto, and the barrenness of the wasted descents below covered with briar and rose campions. To the hangman went the souls of death's peasants. To him were bonded the lineage of a few artisans, and not least the clarity of such a high place, a long firm line of rule. If there was decay, it was only in the walls falling away from proclamations hundreds of years old, still readable, still clear and binding. The sun reached the mountain first, and finally the valley. Each morning I waited for the light, and from the high tower back to the steady winds, I watched the border until I saw the white skeletons of horses and men with hanging heads, the white bones of the legs sinking into the sand, the pistols swinging against pumiced hip bones. An order kept them ever moving around the mountain clock. "Mi scusi, hangman the first," deputy would shout. "It is time to assemble." Leaving, taking another good breath as I turned. My boot might kick a stone from the battlement, and down it would fall until I heard it land with a breaking of shells in one of the rook's nests. that littered the golden vertical cuts of the cliff. My boots were the heaviest of all, black, laced under the knee. The birds made no sound, but suffered these accidents in silence, as if natural. The cloud formations over Sassofeltore were consistent of color, large and geometric, the clear head of a Roman heaven. By a decree dating to the Council of Bishops and Gaolers, the heart of the hangman's escutcheon burst and became an owl, with wisdom, horns, and field rodent half destroyed, hardly visible under the talons. The bird, the scholar with his hunger clamped exactingly to the rudimental prey, peered from his shield, tacit, powerful, bits of ruff and gut caught to his savage bill, the owl. And the hangman, as they come down the inviolable line, sat or hooked the demanding winged beasts upon their necks and shoulders, lordly claws digging into lordly men, and assumed rule to the archaic slow drumming of the nocturnal thick wings against their ears, bearing instantaneously the pain of authority injected directly into their bloodstreams, as the owl clutched and hooted of old upon the darkened tree-tops. The owl kept watch on peasant and prefect alike. He sat erect, taking keen sanctuary among the stones of the campanile, unmoved while slitting the thin stomach of some gray animal with his beak, or dusting with his low-matted feathers our rubrics. On a cold throne, twisted branch, he kept a mute, tenacious, arbitrary peace, fit with little exercise, thirsting quietly for the scrap of ligament or skin needed to keep him cloaked above the city another 100 years. He had a foul breath, a deadly hold, and was quick. His eyes, and the trembling in the short armor feathers, the beak that when sated remained locked, were for the cold law and sermon that came out of the forest to make the husbandman quake. To some he brought this surety of judgment, and the vision, challenging, of the broken neck. I am speaking of myself. Il gufo. To the hangman also went a senatorial apartment and a donkey. Faggots for the cold of winter were supplied on the hunched back of a creature, Monco, who had in his youth fallen from a parapet of the fortress and survived. They in Sassofeltore said that I rubbed soot on my face before sleep, that I possessed a lock of every hanged man's hair, that I confessed once a year to a Jesuit exiled from the Holy See, and that I collected about me varieties of stinging insects. None of this. My walls, ceilings, and stairwells were painted often with a white chalk, fresh and sharp as bone, and not a shadow went undetected. The sun was urged down the spires of the scaffold, but the old men of Sassofeltore needed to talk of their hangman. Up and down the cleared streets they went, peering overhead lest the bough break, spoke of young women in wait at home, every day combing their hair in a different style. Each villa, townhouse, hut became an urgent convent. Most, like Antonina, were mistresses of bridal chests filled with 7 years' accumulation of lace and white bodices, linen, and trinkets that were bolted from the rain. Their fathers plied for them by day toward the countryside. Down on the rocks they beat their hands under the prison windows. The girls were not merely virgin. Those unseen propagated a sense of the timelessness of denial, of death hung rocking around and around on the broken spoked wheel atop a pole. Little Ginevra was kept at home. Antonina, with compressed jaws, came to see for herself the smoke rising from the mass, the even rows of old women paddling their wash, the air of vigil and continuance over the bridled province. He hangs them until dead. Will we have a race of executioners, signore? Let her be still. However, they turned to stare, to speculate on Il Gufo with or without hopes of conjugation, even though the custom of ribaldry and carousing during the season of the summer fair fell more and more into disuse. The men now alive, remaining, had not often seen me in a black hood, and waited for the sight. Storms came from the prohibited east of the ocean. Green and sudden, and sometimes mixed with snow, they battered first the fortress, tearing the bartizans, dislodging and rolling into the air the rooks incapable of opening their wings. For kilometers the rose campions were pierced under the hail, and the vineyards bodingly destroyed. Rain scrubbed the high cobblestones, made the straw roofs swell and doors swell, imprisoning Sassofeltore behind the thickened jambs. Nowhere could a man walk without seeing through the rain the city's virginal design, the plan of its builders, the sheer blackness of stone intended to resist and put tooth to the howl and sluice of water, intact as it was, echoing, beset with the constant fall of the ruin, unviolated and dark as in the holy day curfew of the year 1200. No storm could dislodge those early, grimly smelted chains, but rather gave the city its victory in its architecture fixed, steeply pitched, weather-beaten. Not a bolt rang. As a prosecuted law, with the ashes of suffering and memory carried off on the wind, Sassofeltore was a judgment passed upon the lava, long out of date, was the more intolerant and severe. Only the absolute wheel is known, old as it is, and I looked for the first exacting laws in the archaic, listened for the skidding of an obsolete machine in the narrow, driving streets. He shall be dead by means described hereafter, on the first sunless day to come, and his soul shall said to exist no more. The census of Sassofeltore was set with the great seal of depuration, jugglers, actors, lame soldiers, all condemned and hanged. The snow, falling morning and night upon the head and arms of the Donna, inevitably ended in an hour brighter than any seasons, and one, two, but no more children, and perhaps my ward Precento, slid down the slopes on their bare haunches. Hatless, without sweaters, 1 or 3 black merrymakers scaled down the white field, kicking against the snow, careful to make no noise, each figure far apart and a speck black as a devil's finger. Then Signor Barabo, Antonina's father, would climb into the town, up the narrow street with his brief under his arm and head bent as if looking for a drop of blood on the snow. He stopped to read every proclamation again. He had some divination into the past, for he knew that a hanged man's legs were bound at the ankles, that once the body is on the rope, it is at the executioner's disposal to hang it as long as he wished, a week or a day. And while thinking of this ritual, Signor Barabo thought at the same time of the ritual in which the groom and groomsmen were about to fall upon his Antonina, corset, mantilla, and all. The road up the valley was almost impassable in the snow. A thin fox, the old man might traverse it, but the way was unbroken, as if the forbidden horizon of the sea had crept during the night to our walls and pickets. My donkey's hoofs split in winter. Still, I drove him each day under the 7-foot arches of Sassofeltore, burdened with a saddle built of wood and iron, and bound to him by a girth that froze and cut the belly. The tips of the donkey's ears were cut through, and a small rusted bell permanently fixed to each, that jangled to his uneven gait and high station. Astride him early in the cold and short-breathed brilliant morning, the pinnacle of Sassofeltore was like a crag summoned from the Alpine assizes, I sometimes heard the prefect's voice piping our drawn streets. Permesso, countrymen, good morning. I would pull sharply on the bridle. In Sassofeltore, all but the prefect welcomed the communication of interdicts, whether cried or posted. Blaspheme no more! Il gufo! During the rain, or after one of the determined snowfalls, this injunction met the eye of every man and boy and was obeyed. The fox was traditionally the blasphemer, and the white length of the Idle Valley Road was littered with the red carcass trapped in winter by a few terrified children blowing on their fingers. My ward Pucento cut the tail off close as he could. I saw Signor Barabo cover the fox hastily with snow. A dead fox meant another wedless day. Signor Barabo forever carried with him some item intimate to the nuptial, the garter, the soldi the bride tucks against her bosom, some aphrodisiac trinket he had spirited from Antonina's 7-year store. One of the articles often in his possession was the private purse she carried under her skirts, and this he displayed under the priest's window, as if a lucky impregnation might come between the secular nectary and the sacred. Signor Barabo's heart, consciousness, and ambition ended in an appendage that housed the kidney and overhung his groin like a tapir's snout. Blind sack he lightly rubbed while discoursing and guardedly measuring the passers-by. He had a large flap hanging from the shoulder under cover of his coat. On winter evenings, when his old wife massaged it with liniment, he struck her and, enraged, leaned over again so that the deformity rose up with uncanny liveliness to be oiled. Outside he was a peasant, inside a fish whose concealed pouches could inflate to considerable size until he groaned in his own monstrous dimensions. My daughter Antonina, will be ready to take her husband immediately after the Pentecost. Antonina was a woman with a narrow girdle and face the soft color of an olive. It gave me the same strong feeling of satisfaction to see her as it did to spy my ward Pacento falling about in the snow, the western gradation of white marred by the far-off kicking and helpless salutes of his lengthy arms and legs, an autonomous and senseless play before the afternoon closed to the rising of the wind. It pleased me to watch him attempting to steady himself, the black straw on his head rolling across the snow field, one at least from whom the owl could snatch a river fish without trouble, so valueless was he. Idyllic his thin trunk, woman's voice, his pranks in which he exposed his shivery loins unwittingly to the power around him. Pacento, as my ward, remained to hurtle himself against Sassofeltore's grave unrestored stones, a jest of flesh, angular, laughing, incompetent. Pacento. Early in the morning I leaned over his bed. Pacento, I said until he opened his eyes, and, but a moment awake, flat on his back and face to face with Il Gufo, he would try to answer, fall to twisting from side to side, clutching at the gray shirt he slept in and grimacing. He little thought of jesting if I caught him with the dream still on his fingertips, and if I broke in upon his disarray and refuge. Buongiorno, Pacento. As soon as I moved, he lapsed into sleep again. Waking later, he, his own medium, he would bolt for the cold street, shouting, "Faggots! Faggots!" heels skipping high as his knee, and wailing as if the wood might crawl to him at a slow-moving pace. The parochial owl hooted, and Pacento made a good deal of noise before he thought better. At night he sat in front of the wintry red brazier, and I put him to work kneading my virgin rope coils. He ate cheese cut from a large white tub. The owl stood above us like a thick-chested, legless, disciplined commandant facing between torn forests, a ragged enemy of Austerlitz. I watched the coming of dark from the high tower. Sassofeltore, its roofs sharply crumpled and pitted below me, grew dark, but never completely invisible, always some fragment of thatch or colored glass withstanding the night. There was only part shelter in the tower. I stood with my shoulders hidden in the damp, and one fist and my face raised, exposed to the rush of air, the long fall away to the villas and water-wheel lost below, that curious feeling in the fortress of half-human, half-mildew of history, a precarious high post with the open night in front and a wet niche in the stones behind. I gripped one of the cornices, and the moon passed, small, cold, flying between the dead trees. The ordeal of older tribunals, the plagues that attended the newborn, and the roof of black stoop-shouldered angels that awaited them, the fibre and the crack of the ferule amongst the population, these I thought of in the evening, when my boot heel ground under a bit of fortress rock scum. Down, in the dark, the peasants were eating their macaroni, flatbread, and a paste made of sheep gut. On each wooden table was a liter flask. The wine was new as sap. It was as if I saw them all, corselet, benches, arms, and legs, Garibaldi's burning in a cold and windy piazza. So certainly they were in the outer and lower spaces, peaceful. And behind the huts, near the mouth of the cave, marked by a white statue of the Donna on a pedestal, lay Sassofeltore's forests, barbed and stripped to order. Here the female owl scratched at her blue egg with a diamond. Signore, he sleeps in black sheets. Black straw lies in his stable. I would not give him my daughter. No, master, not even if he does eat, I've heard said, the pulp of freshly crushed deer antlers. Cross yourself, signore. Take my advice. Like oxmen huddled around a milk cart in a dry rut, they had their opinions. But whatever the issue that gave shape to the head and bulged the eyes was the catechism, the death of a prized boar, or a remark about little Ginevra's beauty, the old men soaked their hands in warmed oil, and all their thoughts and feelings, the very grayness of hair, vanished when the hangman put on his black cape. It was the prefect who kept the streets picked clean. I could urge my donkey to a gallop until his shoulder blades rubbed and the bells tinkled unnaturally at the tips of his long white ears, and from one end of Sassofeltore to the other I could see dry gutters, not a dead raven or a cat, no new piling of dung, and, down below, the captive sewerage. The small man, fastidious only in size and weight, scourged the lice. Short, thin, his bones so many that they formed, instead of a skeleton, a mesh. Across his chest were belted two thin straps pulled to the last hole. The prefect inspected cupboard and water closet, descended into foundations hunting for ripened curd, wielding his torch and four-headed pike. His badge bore the wolves at the dugs, his brief epaulettes, his black hair hewn to the narrow side, and he obeyed, though not without pinching his little lip until it became white. He lived alone below the fortress, within shouting distance of the dungeon, sleeping on a cot like a field commander. Martial drum and thin trunks of plants were hung about the walls and obscured the windows. Of all the prefect's belongings, only his stately ganders seemed descended from Sassofeltore's own lofty impartiality. His four red-eyed birds, though they had little to eat, covered the countryside in good regiment, their tense, hungry step marching over sand, ashes, trampling the rose campions. No girl could drive these white creatures in such formation, and one behind the other, making no noise, they hunted small game and insects. To see them in single file atop the fortress, even I looked up, or below in the ravines, winding their way among the dead, always white, sharp billed, not so beautiful that they would keep from scavenging. Sometimes only the necks were visible, long white necks that might be broken in a dozen places. Fierceness and starvation were evident in the gander's windpipes, unreasonably stretched in God's dark and genic pillory. The fowl survived, now holding their flat-honed bills high a sway against the horizon. The four of them, Sasso Fettore's flock, never emitted the shrill crabbing sounds of their species, but appeared on the steep, slippery cobblestones in silence, checking themselves, and it was with precision, quickly, that they pecked anyone who crossed their path, thrust forward the snowy Netherlandish throats like serpents. Sometimes I tempted them with my fingers, but they did not bite, and continued their marching. Perhaps Sasso Fittore was most lofty when no one was in sight. When the owl was at his instruction and outside the ganders were poised, making little headway against the sunset, the blue wind ruffling their single file, when the rope swaying from the tall lady dangled idly like a ship cable in the middle of the voyage, and the province, sloping upward, was burnished red and gold, like a Florentine coin, before night. Faintly, in his knotty ears, the donkey's bells would jangle, and the fortress, with its rocky view, showed its temporary darkling life of lanterns. Buona notte, hangman. Good shelter, whispered the last to leave the streets. The clapper hung silent in the campanile, while it was still day, the curfew formidable over sagging bellies, over the aged coveting their anchovies in the dark, out of sight. I looked up, down. Sasso Fittore held the spirit, the law of the swift leg, stones reddening above a country that had no marsh. At the last moment, before the windy collapse of the day, swiftly it deserted, sinking to another meridian. I myself took the road down toward the ravines and stakes of shriveling berries, keeping to the center of the way, holding firmly the donkey's jaw. A little dust rose some feet behind, and from the cliff, huddled under the balustraria far overhead, I might hear old men playing the viola da gamba, their black coats sawing musically to the left and right in the very position of skirmishers. Many ravines were empty, offering at most a bit of crackling skin cast off from the snake, a dark spot where moisture was working up from the center of the earth, but in others sat the foot fighters who would run no more, the burned bodies listing into the sand. I rode on the edge of these pits, and then through them I counted the backs of the heads. I looked at them lying upon the earth like assassinated sheep. The remains of a water-cooled cannon were driven deep into the sand. The trenches were filled with letters. In the moonlight I looked at them. Letters dropped during the summer and again the next summer on the faces of the dead. The letters were strewn upon the cinders, and some had been torn open by animals, and some stuck to my boot heel. I pulled the donkey after me and could not control where he stepped. The dead were lieges to Sasso Fittore's hangman, a shari parliament with which he met at dusk, having no voices to raise, and unable to tell which limbs were lost, or which ribs had been staved in the process of death's accomplishment, what weight of marrow and gut given. The numbers I stumbled on, pitifully small, did accrue in some historic calculation, out of their tangle raising an arithmetic council, that gave more body to their subservience than the hair, cloth, and tissue withering. I climbed through the ashes, hearing my foot turn over a trench knife or wooden shoe, and the contortions, the shrinking about the knees, the unexpected oddments I found poking in the soot in a Roman fire were symmetrical, ordered, suitable as the leaning masts topped by slowly turning wheels that were implanted, some signaling device, not monument, in their midst. It was here I thought of Antonina going to her bed. Night. I was a lonely rider who urged his donkey into an overheated aged canter on the lesser slopes, and fast even as we returned up the mountain, the road became straight and high, bleak with hoarfrost. My boots, protecting as jumbo, rubbed his hide back near the tender joining of haunches. The spurs rang. Behind I was followed by speechless adventure, the impersonal ganders. Below, the foot soldiers must wait another inspection, thoughtlessly camped in the hollows where the summer fairs were pitched. Balcony, turret, cloister, arcade, the stones immobile in tempest, all silent and austere, the city descended a few hundred meters and stopped, formidable even to me. A city through the center of which grappled the prefect's four hooks, a place part chalet, part slaughterhouse, with scrollwork upon the gables and brass crowns upon the chimneys, a province whose wooden coffins were lined with porcelain, whose garrets were filled with ransacked portraits of dignitaries and half-eaten goose. Without mass violence, Sassofeltore was still unmerciful. It was visible in the moonlight, purposeful as the avalanche of rock and snow. Here, in the cellars and under roofs far as the boundary, the old men slept in their stockings, and the others, confident wives, warmed wedding bands in their armpits. Politically, historically, Sassofeltore was an eternal Sabbath. Using flint, iron, and tinder, I struck a flame to the candle at the base of the white statue of the Donna, to whom was attributed tolerable beauty and humility, and who was thought to destroy dreams. Perhaps to her could be laid the spirit of black and white in the peasant, that suited their soft flesh in both valediction and penalty. Surely the Donna made the scaffold majestic. Week after week of Sabbaths attested to this, when the regiment set down for the citizens was not perfectly autonomous, and in the blue night some worshipped object was accountable to the spirit, or the spirit for a moment was awed in some simple fashion, when the law gave bony strength to the lover of Donna and legend. The character and the code, right upon right, crashed into the pale heart when the culprit hanged, her prayers for him so soft as hardly to be heard. She saved none, salvation not being to the purpose, yet, like the virgins, stood off with low head and waited for movement from him bound on the gibbet. Her statue was placed before the cave near the forest and owl's tree. And the prisoner, perhaps he too had his Donna or some lady to accompany him to captivity. Perhaps he too had his fragile witness in another language, and blessed in that outlandish tongue. And if so, perhaps she lent him an untouchable comfort in the cell, peace, his Angelo keeping him quiet as he kissed her feet, or paid whatever was her homage. Perhaps she assured him of clemency and calmed him, but I would think not. Guai! Guai! The sound made my ward Pucento pull his hands and wince about the eyes and mouth. It was Pucento who started the rumor that I would hang him immediately after the Pentecost. The Pentecost! How could he know the day? Several paths led to the fortress. The approaches to the prison that appeared so inaccessible from the slopes below or from the boundaries, on some mornings the patrol raised their skeletal hands, were ready, easy, and at one turning there was even an abandoned pump, as if it was here that visitors were expected to drag their mounts, here that they should stop naturally to drink, being able to climb little further. All men wanted to reach quickly to see for themselves either the high tower or the low, bloodying their fingers if necessary, sparing not their heart valves or horse. At a bend in the high path there were loose stones that, along with nature's debris deposited in the ruin, fell down upon the rocks. Antonina let her hair drape against the rotted pump, the wood of which concealed in its grain 100 eyes. The ganders favored the low path with their rhythmic scuttling, their search for food out of the rocky air. There was a place in the middle path, steepest and most direct way to the fortification, where from an irregular hole in the rock no larger than 3 fingers flowed a constant trickle of water, always to be found stirring, always seeping down, draining from the dungeons, on the brightest of days, and though it had not rained for weeks. It was water, they said, that cooled the ardor. In the morning, early, the unshaved prefect climbed to the prisoner with unusual speed, as if to put his lips to the treacherous and unruly ram's horn. Bloodshot, hurrying when it was not yet his hour to come to the streets, he avoided my eye, a nightmare still fresh in his head, and as he passed he covered his eye nearest me with the glove that pinched the fingers and left the wrist bare, hardly saluting, carrying his water quickly along in a rat's sack. And already the prisoner studied the lines in his hands, and picked at his incomprehensible tin insignia, the badge of those about to die in public. And still, Signor Barabo tried to speak to the prisoner. He petitioned to husband him. He asked for his name, promising him, sure of my pardon, consigning his very procreative parts to this daughter or that, and joining him to his otherwise fruitless family. And Signor Baraba was not alone. The men, oldest of all, with lids falling away from canine eyes, with clay pipes wrapped around their fingers, could be seen every day dusting the studs, the iron, the boot toes, a long and tenuous bell pull, hook-backed and hard at work polishing the war horse. They uncorked bottles of spumante. The prefect talked, and in the excitement some suppliant thought to smear the face of the donna with blood. There was more spumante. I, hangman of Sasso Fattore, prepared in another manner to give them a spectacle that would bring a laugh, a cry, and an upsurge even from my confessor, the Jesuit. I washed down the scaffolding brought from the 7th hill. I, hangman of Sasso Fattore, set in motion the proceedings that drew ledgers from their vaults and ink-pots to the oak table, pushing the rafters, the spokes, the axle cold and thick with bear grease, touching these ancient parts in the law's carriage house, and through the city I had justice dragged on 100 wheels roped to the distended body. I went to see if they also were ready. But he has a fine stand, has he not? The other, bowing his head, answered, He has, signore. And the old man, muttering to himself, would set off as if to settle the matter immediately, jogging his proposals and senility, muttering in Sasso Fattore's pantomime, smiling down the hill, and moving his lips.